Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. In the 2 minutes that remain before class begins today, does anyone have any questions about anything we've done in the past or what's on the horizon?
Oh, I have a question. Will the previous exam be accessible to us? Like, can we review the answers?
You should be able to do that now. I got to double check to make sure the settings allow you to do that, but you should be able to go back to your first exam and take a look at the answers. If not, either let me know. I might check that after class, but you should be able to. That is intended.
Okay, because I was thinking of using all the exams as like a study guide for the midterm or the final exam that we have.
Yeah,
I
I was
think
getting that idea too.
Yes, I think that is a very good idea, and that is intended for me to, let you have the ability to do that. So I will double check that after class, and if for whatever reason I forget or you don't have access to it, just email me and we'll figure it out.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions before we begin for today? Okay, well, as I stated in the email, for those of you that are just coming in, I was pretty impressed with the overall grades that were coming in for the papers as well as for the exams. Starting with the papers, I believe the class average was around an 85, 86. There were around 5 or 6 students, I got to check back, they got a perfect score on the paper, so kudos to you all. And there were even more students that got Bs as well as some As. And of course, there are some students that didn't do too well either. Some of the more common reasons I was taking off points had to do with either not answering the question or not answering the question fully or just not building a cohesive argument. Moving to the exams, there were also at least 4 or 5 students that got a perfect score on the exam in this section, which was fantastic. Also a lot of Bs, a lot of As. And of course, there were still some students that didn't do very well. But for those students that didn't do as well as they hoped, by no means is it over in this class for your chances to get an A. None of you received a 0 on the first exam. So mathematically, it is, yes.
I was actually really, really surprised with the grade that I got on the paper because I literally only started that paper like 2 days or something before it was due.
Gotcha. Got to check back on yours in particular. But yeah, I mean, I was generally pretty happy with most of the papers that were coming in and the arguments that were being built for the most part. And it's also the first paper, right? So I'm just trying to gauge right now, how can you build an argument? Are you building it effectively, cohesively? You putting in some evidence, maybe some personal experience to kind of give it some flavor. But going back to the exams for a second, nobody received a 0 for the exam. So it's still mathematically possible for all of you to still get an A in this class. So by no means is it over. It's just now time to start getting yourself on the right track, studying a little bit more, reaching out to me during office hours, and we will find a way to get you where you need to be. Okay. Any questions pertaining to assignments that have just taken place? Okay, well, there's no other questions pertaining to that. We can begin the first part of exam 2's content period. Right, so we just got finished up wrapping up exam 1's content period, and one big theme of exam 1's content period was the role of biology in psychology. And we came to the overarching conclusion that everything psychological is rooted in biology in some way, shape, or form. So to bridge the gap between what we talked about in exam 1's content period and what we're going to be talking about today in exam 2's content period with sensation and perception, we're going to learn that sensation to a large extent is a physical process that involves the detection of physical stimuli by biological organs on our body, like our eyes and our ears. We're also going to learn, in contrast, that perception is a psychological process that happens in your mind. Okay. So of course, this is going to be the topic we learn all about how we see and hear and taste and touch and smell and so forth, as well as the origins of visual and auditory illusions. Okay. But before we can get into all the mechanics of how that works, we first got to define some key terminology, beginning first with sensation. Sensation is a physical process by which our sensory organs respond to external stimuli. Okay, a physical process by which our sensory organs respond to external stimuli. Let me break that down for you all to make it a little bit clearer. So first and foremost, sensation is a physical process that involves the detection of physical stimuli out there in our external world, such as light waves when it comes to everything that we're seeing, whereas everything that we're hearing is represented out there in the world in the form of sound waves. And these physical stimuli in the form of light waves and sound waves, respectively, are detected by sensory organs on our body. Most notably in this case, our eyes and our ears. Our eyes detect the light waves, whereas our ears detect the sound waves. But with that in mind, is seeing and hearing happening out there in the world like we think it is? Well, consider this age-old riddle. If a tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to hear it, does it actually make a sound? In fact, I remember asking you guys this at the very start of the semester, and I remember getting a lot of yeses, actually, a few no's. But the literal answer to that question is no, it does not make a sound. It turns out you don't see color in the same way you don't hear sound the way you think you do. Rather, seeing color and hearing sound requires an active perceiver to be present. And if that active perceiver is not present, when that tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to hear it, all that it's emitting are sound waves. But sound waves are essentially just changes in air pressure and changes in air vibration that have no essential properties of sound to them whatsoever. An active perceiver is required for sound as we know it to be heard. But we run into another problem. Even if an active perceiver is present, it turns out our brain does not have a built-in mechanism to meaningfully understand light waves or sound waves, respectively. Rather, those light waves and sound waves need to be converted into a language that our brain understands. And if you remember our lecture on biology in the mind, the language of our brain is neural impulses. And the process of converting those physical stimuli of light waves and sound waves into neural impulses is known as transduction. The conversion of physical energy into neural impulses. The way in which I want you to think about transduction, to give you an analogy, is it's somewhat analogous to this idea of a language translator. So let's say you're trying to have a conversation with somebody who speaks a different language than you do. That communication session is likely going to be a little bit difficult, to say the least. But if there is a language translator in the room that can convert in between languages, well, now that communication session is going to go a whole lot easier. A very similar idea is happening with this transduction process, as we have sensory receptors in our sensory organs, such as our eyes and our ears, that convert those light waves and sound waves into neural impulses. And when that physical energy is converted into neural impulses, we then begin the ultimate experience of perception, the psychological process of making sense of stimuli. Okay. Now, you'll notice here that one big difference between sensation and perception, and I've italicized it for you here, is that whereas sensation is a physical process that involves the detection of physical stimuli out there in the world, perception, on the other hand, is a psychological process that happens in your mind. Seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and feeling isn't happening out there in the world like you think it is. It's happening in your mind. And there's a lot of interesting effects that we've observed at the level of perception. Consider that we find that two people can interpret the same stimulus in two very different ways. Take music. Perhaps you had a friend or family member share a song with you, and to your friend or family member, that song is so powerful that it can even move them to tears, maybe because it resonates with their background or past relationships. But when you hear the song, you kind of put your hands up in the air and say to yourself, what's all the fuss about, right? You may not even like the song, right? That's just one example of how two people can interpret the same song in two vastly different ways. Also consider color perception, right? Maybe you've had a disagreement with a friend or a family member on perhaps what shade of color is on an object. Maybe you're looking at a car and you think that car is a lighter shade of purple, but your friend thinks it's a darker shade of purple. But differences in color perception need not always be that subtle. Sometimes they can be dramatic, as in the case of the
Professor?
stress. Yes.
When you were talking about perception, like this reminds me of like something that I saw recently. Like I saw a clip from a TV show in the early 2000s called what was it, a Fringe? Like in one of those episodes they were talking about like how like in that clip they were showing like a series of images, like how we look at it like one way in one certain color it looks like a rabbit, but then if you look at it another way and then with another color it looks like a duck. I think he was trying to explain like how like our brain will like process like the information given in specific ways.
What you're saying is very relatable and very applicable to what we're about to talk about right now. Okay, so let's get to this stress.
Right.
So this stress was widely circulated around the year of 2015, in part because people were reporting seeing this dress in vastly different colors, right? Some people report seeing the dress as black and blue. Others report seeing the dress as white and gold. And still others report seeing the dress as blue and gold. Okay. Were you trying to say something? Okay.
Yeah, you said, you said gold and white and gold, which it is.
So the dress is actually black and blue. There's been a lot of reports that the dress is actually black and blue. We're going to talk about that shortly. But some people even see the dress change colors, right? But I want to know what you guys see. Okay. So, but rather than you all blurt out what you see, I actually want you guys to use the chat feature. So if you see the dress as black and blue, type a 1 in the chat. Any black and blues, type a 1 in the chat. Okay, seeing some 1s rolling in here. A lot of people see it as black and blue. All right, what about white and gold? Type a 2 in the chat for white and gold. Okay, we got some 2s rolling in here. All right, if you see the dress as any other combination of color, put a 3 in the chat. Okay, so a lot of black and blues, a lot of white and golds, right? So this is an excellent illustration of how there can be vastly different changes in our perception. And of course, we want to know, how does this happen? And admittedly, we're going to be discussing all of the ins and outs of these kinds of illusions throughout the course of today's lecture and our next class. But to at least give you a taste of what's going on here, we know that at the level of sensation, you all are taking in those light waves in exactly the same way. Rather, the differences we're seeing is happening at the level of perception. It's happening with respect to how your mind is automatically interpreting, in this case, the light behind that dress right here. For those of you that have minds that are automatically interpreting the light behind that dress as stemming from artificial light, say from yellow light from a lamp, your mind sees any yellow on that dress as being a reflection of the light and compensates by seeing the dress as black and blue. In contrast, for those of you that have minds that are automatically interpreting the light behind that dress as being from natural light, say from a bright blue sky, your mind compensates for that by instead seeing the dress as white and gold. And that's generally how that happens. But as I suggested, we're going to be spending most of today's class and our next class going into all the details of what's going on here. But it turns out, right, that there is a right answer to this. As I suggested, a lot of reports have come out to say that the dress is actually black and blue. So if you're seeing this dress as any other color than black and blue, your mind is literally tricking you to seeing colors on an object that don't actually exist on that object, which is wild to think about. And if that doesn't get you at least a little bit interested in psychology, I'm not sure what will, because this is vintage psychology. Any questions on that up to this point? Okay, well, before we completely leave this dress illusion, I actually want to share with you guys another illusion. This one is an auditory illusion. So I'm going to put in the chat here for a second a link to a YouTube video that's going to present to you a Yanni or Laurel illusion. Okay, so here it is in the chat. Go ahead, take some time. It's only about 30 seconds long. You're either going to hear Yanni or you're going to hear Laurel. So I'll give you about a minute to watch that video. It's only 30 seconds.
Professor, would you mind muting yourself just so I can hear the video a little bit better, please?
Sure, sorry. Okay, so it looks like we got a lot of people reporting what they're hearing from that video. So I'm hearing some Yannis, I'm hearing some Laurels here. So what's going on is that it boils down to how your mind is automatically interpreting the pitch of that sound, generally speaking. For those of you that have minds that are automatically interpreting the pitch of that sound as being lower, you're going to hear Laurel because Laurel is low. In contrast, for those of you that have minds that are automatically interpreting the pitch of that sound as high, you're going to hear Yanni because Yanni is high. And that's generally how that happens. And you'll note that the same general process is happening across both that visual illusion and that auditory illusion. It boils down to how your mind is automatically interpreting those sights and sounds that we largely don't have a lot of control over. There's a lot of processes that happen with our perception that are going on well below the level of conscious awareness. Okay, so I hope you found these kinds of demonstrations somewhat insightful, because where we're going next is we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the mechanics behind them. But before we can get into those mechanics, we got to take this back to where it all starts. And where this all starts is at the level of sensation. Okay, I want to talk about how we sense our world. Okay, starting first with something known as the absolute threshold. Absolute thresholds refer to the minimum stimulation necessary to detect a single sensation at least half the time it's present. The minimum stimulation necessary to detect a single sensation at least half the time it's present. And a really good example of this, in my opinion, is something as simple as, say, a hearing test. So when you go to the doctor, the reason that doctor is emitting really soft sounds into your ears is they're trying to test if your absolute threshold for hearing is within normal and healthy levels. Because if you're not hearing the kinds of things you should be hearing in that hearing test, it could be an indication that your absolute threshold for hearing is higher than it should be, and could be indicative of some degree of hearing loss or hearing damage. Okay. Now, signal detection theory synthesizes the kinds of decisions that people can make within contexts like a hearing test. So I want to draw your attention now to the bottom right-hand corner of the screen where there is a 2x2 decision matrix, where in something as simple as, say, a hearing test, there's at least 2 correct decisions we can make, as well as 2 incorrect decisions we can make. Starting first with the correct decisions, one correct decision is a hit. So in the context of a hearing test, this would be saying you heard a sound when the sound was actually present. You can also make a correct rejection, where you say that you didn't hear a sound when the sound was actually not present. But there's also 2 mistakes you can make. One mistake is a miss. So this is where you report not hearing a sound when the sound was actually present. And as I suggested prior, this may be an indication that your absolute threshold for hearing is higher than it should be, and you're not hearing the kinds of things you should be hearing, perhaps because of hearing loss or hearing damage. But there's still one more mistake we could make, a false alarm. This is where we report that we heard a sound when the sound was actually not present. So perhaps in this case, your absolute threshold for hearing is lower than it should be, and you're hearing some sounds that aren't actually there. Now, although occasional false alarms in something, say, like a hearing test, like, some mistakes are totally normal and sometimes they happen, there are some instances where it can become so extreme that these false alarms start eliciting a lot of distress and dysfunction in people's lives. Consider, for example, people who suffer from schizophrenia, who report hearing voices in their heads that literally are people that literally aren't even there, right? Clearly, that's starting to enter into the realm of distress and dysfunction, okay? But signal detection theory also makes predictions as to when people are likely to make one kind of mistake over the other. Consider, for example, men and their attraction perceptions. We have a lot of evidence that men tend to make a lot of false alarms when deciding if a woman is into them or not. In other words, men tend to have a very low absolute threshold for deciding if a woman likes them or is attracted to them. In fact, a woman could just smile in the direction of a man, and a man may be very inclined to say that woman is totally into them. In contrast, we find that women, on average, tend to make more misses when it comes to attraction perceptions. In other words, they're a little bit more inclined to say that someone is not into them when maybe they actually are. And there's been a lot of research as pertaining to why exactly this is the case. And some research suggests that it may have at least something to do with self-esteem. So to the extent to which women's self-esteem may be on average a little bit lower than men, that could potentially filter into their perceptions of their own attractiveness levels and increase the likelihood that they could make a miss, saying that someone is not into them when maybe they actually are. Okay. As one final example, consider phantom phone vibrations, which is something we talked about in our lecture on biology of the mind, where people report feeling a vibration from their phone on some part of their body when it never actually happened. And a part of the reason this occurs is that our mind becomes so used to this phone vibrating on a part of our body that sometimes our sensory systems will misfire and report a signal to our brain telling us that something occurred when it never actually vibrated. So in this case, we're making false alarms because our absolute threshold for feeling a vibration is so low that sometimes our sensory systems misfire and we felt a vibration though it never actually happened. Okay. Any questions on this concept of absolute thresholds? Okay, so before we leave this term, you'll notice that I also italicized a very important word here, single. Okay, absolute thresholds are very relevant when we're detecting one single sensation at a time. But as you can imagine, there are also some instances where we're interested in detecting the difference between at least two sensations. For that, we turn our attention to the just noticeable difference, or J&D for short. The just noticeable difference refers to the minimum ability to detect the difference between at least two stimuli. Okay, so now we're not just talking about one, we're talking about the difference between two. And one good example of this is your car's radio and outside noise. So let's say you get in your car to go to work or school or a doctor's appointment, wherever. And on your car's radio, let's say for the sake of argument that it spans from 1 to 10, with 10 being the loudest setting and 1 being, of course, the softest setting. And you can listen to your music comfortably in your car at around the level of a 5. But now as you're driving, you enter into an area along your commute that's really loud, right? Maybe really loud construction noise. Maybe that construction noise is at the level of a 7. So now you can't hear your car's radio all that well. So what do? Well, of course, you crank up the volume. Now, objectively speaking, you should be able to crank that volume up to an 8, 1 point higher than the construction noise at a 7, and hear your music comfortably. But that's not what happens. You still can't hear your music very well. In fact, you usually have to dial it up to 11 just to hear your music comfortably over that construction noise. But why do we have to crank our music up so loud to hear it over this other loud sound? Well, a lot of it has to do with something known as Weber's law. And this is one of the few laws that we have in psychology's history. Okay? According to Weber's law, larger stimuli have larger just noticeable difference thresholds. Larger stimuli have larger just noticeable difference thresholds. To put that another way, it's harder to tell the difference between 2 really loud sounds than it is 2 really soft sounds. Okay, it's harder to tell the difference between 2 really loud sounds than 2 really soft sounds. Let's go back to these decibel differences here. Let's take a 5 decibel difference between 40 and 45 decibels. These are relatively soft sounds. In fact, this is around the level of normal conversation speech. I'm speaking right now at around the range of 40 decibels. But if I elevate my voice to 45 decibels, you can pick up on that difference incredibly easily. Okay? But now let's take that 5 decibel difference between 110 decibels and 115 decibels. These are really loud sounds. So this is the difference, say, between the construction noise outside at around 110 decibels and your car's radio at around 115 decibels. It's much harder to tell the difference between these 2 really loud sounds than it is these 2 really soft sounds, which is why for the second case here, with louder sounds, we have to crank our music up to 11 just so we can hear it comfortably. That's Weber's law. Let me give you another example, though, this time with respect to weight. So let's say you just went grocery shopping and you're bringing in bags. The first 2 bags you bring in are really light. So maybe the difference between a half gallon of milk and a bag of bread. Very easy to tell the difference between those 2 things. But then on your second trip, you bring in 2 really heavy bags. Say the difference between 4 liters of soda and maybe 3 liters of soda. A little bit more difficult to tell the difference between those 2 bags now because they're really heavy to begin with. And it turns out that marketers and advertisers are very keenly aware of Weber's law. So when they're designing deals for products, they recognize that it's very easy to appreciate $1 off for 2 really inexpensive products, like this case on the left here, but it's much harder to appreciate $1 off for 2 really expensive products, even though it's the same deal in both instances, right? Which is why when they're creating deals for expensive products, they usually have to create much larger deals so people actually care, is the idea. Any questions on the just noticeable difference or Weber's law?
Yeah, could you just say the description for Weber's law again?
Sure. According to Weber's law, larger stimuli have a larger just noticeable difference thresholds. Or in other words, it's easier to tell the difference between 2 really soft sounds or small stimuli as opposed to 2 really large stimuli. Any other questions on that? Okay. So we have the ability to detect single sensations as well as the difference between two sensations. We also have a remarkable ability to adapt the sensations in our environment. Sensory adaptation refers to a diminished sensitivity resulting from constant stimulation. And we've already indirectly talked about sensory adaptation phenomena in the past. In fact, going all the way back to our lecture on human development, we learned that babies will kick inside the womb when they hear sounds from their mother that they find very interesting, unique, or novel. But we also learn that babies will kick less often to sounds they hear their mother say all of the time because they no longer find those sounds very interesting or unique. In part because those babies are adapting to those sounds they hear all the time, and they kick less as a consequence of that adaptation. And what this implies is that there's a certain amount of sensory adaptation that's hardwired into our brain before we're even born. Okay. And these sensory adaptation processes are important because they allow us to focus in our environment and adapt to irrelevant distractions. Imagine, for example, if you didn't have the ability to adapt to sensations in your environment. Let's say you're trying to get your homework done, but then you're becoming distracted by a lot of irrelevant sights and sounds around you, right? Could be ambient noise in the room, or the clock ticking on your wall, or traffic going by outside, right? It'd be really difficult to stay alert, focus, and pay attention. In fact, this is a part of the problem that people with ADHD suffer from, where instead of adapting to all these sights and sounds in the environment, it's hitting them all at once, which can feel quite overwhelming, but also make it difficult for them to stay alert, focus, and pay attention. Okay. Now, there's a lot of other really good examples of this. Take large temperature changes. The reason why when you go swimming, the rule of thumb is to just jump right in. Because when you jump right in, you're giving your body the highest possible opportunity to adapt to the cooler temperatures of the water. Okay. Whereas if you tiptoe your way in, like this woman is doing here, you're essentially putting your senses through sensory torture, not giving your body the opportunity to very quickly adapt to the cooler temperature of the water. In fact, as another example of this, let's say it's a really hot day and you walk into an air-conditioned room, and that air-conditioned room feels fantastic. But then just 20 minutes of being in that air-conditioned room, it doesn't feel that cool anymore, right? In fact, it may not be until you walk outside the room back into the hot temperature that you realize how cool it really was in that room because you've adapted to that air conditioning. One final example of this is sleeping with background noise. So as a personal story, when I was a kid, I grew up in a somewhat of an urban area in New Jersey where there was trains and trucks and buses and horns going off. And it was actually very difficult for me to fall asleep when I was a kid. But as the weeks and months and years went by, I eventually started adapting to all those sounds in my environment and I started sleeping a whole lot better. In fact, now I can sleep with a lot of distractions in the room and it doesn't bother me at all. But then I went to rural Ohio for graduate school. And it's also where I met my wife, who grew up in a quiet, rural environment. So we got married and we eventually moved from Ohio back to New Jersey. And we're once again now living in a more urban environment where it's noisy and there's trains and buses and trucks. And in fact, on in the first week of moving into our new house, there's a train that goes by and at midnight, it'll just blare its horn, I think every Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the first time that happened, my wife just jolted out of bed and was like, "What was that?" And I was like, "That's the train." But it didn't startle me. In fact, I was sleeping just fine through it, but it really startled my wife. And in fact, it took her about a few months to start adapting to the noise in the environment, and now she can sleep pretty well. And it's a testament to this idea that the human mind is adaptable. We're flexible to our environmental circumstances, and eventually we have diminished sensitivity from this constant stimulation. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I had a friend who they told me when they were a kid, their parents tickled them so much that they just absolutely lost they're not ticklish anymore. So is that kind of the same thing?
It certainly can be. In fact, somewhat related to what you're talking about, we also have some evidence that for children who've been abused in the household, like repeatedly, it feels bad. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about this on the next slide. But we also start seeing a diminished sensitivity to screaming and yelling and a lot of the chaos that's happening in the household because they start getting used to it, right? So yeah, those are all examples of sensory adaptation.
Professor, I don't know if this counts as sensory adaptation, but like you know, like when you're in, like when you're in, like in the middle of the night when you and you go to the bathroom and you turn on the light in the bathroom and like blinds you for like a few seconds and then your eyes readjust. Is that sensory adaptation?
It is. In fact, we're going to be talking about that exact phenomenon a little bit later today, so stay tuned.
Mm-hmm.
Great question. Okay, now I want to have a very short class activity on this, and I hope this works because when it works, it's actually really cool. So what you see in front of you are 3 different facial expressions of the same woman. So the woman on the far left here is expressing the emotion of anger. The woman on the far right is expressing the emotion of fear or being scared. And some people can also interpret it as looking a little bit confused, but that's the general idea. This woman in the middle has been the face has been artificially constructed by researchers to make it a little bit difficult to tell if she's experiencing anger or fear. So here's what I want you all to do. If your last name begins with the letter ranges from A to M as in Mary, I want you to stare intently at this angry woman here on the far left-hand side. If your last name begins with the letter range N as in Nancy to Z, I want you to stare intensely at the woman on the far right-hand side who's expressing fear. And I want you to keep staring at your respective women until I tell you to stop. And when I tell you to stop, I want everyone to shift over to this face in the middle here and think about what emotion it looks like she's expressing. Okay, everyone got that? All right.
Yes.
Start staring at your respective woman. Okay, swap over to the middle and think about what emotion it looks like she's expressing. Okay, now for those of you that were staring at the woman on the far left who is expressing anger, okay, I want you to type in the chat what emotion this middle woman was expressing. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of confused, I'm seeing some fearful, a little bit of relief, some disgust. Okay, now for those of you that were staring at the woman on the far right-hand side, what emotion was the woman in the middle expressing in the chat? So still seeing some confused, I see some disgust, more confused, a lot of confused. Okay, so it didn't quite work as I hoped it would, and sometimes it doesn't. In fact, this particular activity is kind of a 50-50 hit rate when I do it for my classes. But what was supposed to happen, at least, is that if you were staring at the angry woman, in fact, it actually worked better for the people who are staring at the angry face on the left-hand side. As you keep staring at this angry face, you start adapting to that angry face. So when you spontaneously jump over to the middle, it makes it look a little bit more fearful, confused, or scared by comparison, right? And that actually worked pretty well. But for the people who are staring at the scared or fearful or confused face on the far right-hand side, what was supposed to happen is you start adapting to that fearful phase. So when you spontaneously jump over to the middle, it should look relatively more angry by comparison. And that's generally what should have happened. So it kind of half worked. But to give you an application of this in everyday life, consider people who say are staying in abused relationships, right? Now, to be sure, there's a lot of reasons why people may be staying in an abusive relationship. Some reasons pertain to feeling psychologically or physically trapped. Other people may have low self-esteem. Others may be blaming themselves. Others may have an intense fear of being alone. But sensory adaptation provides yet another explanation for why people may decide to stay in these relationships. Because for those people that are staying in these relationships for months, and even as the years go by, they start adapting to all the chaos that's happening in the household. It starts feeling normal to start your day with people screaming and yelling, or maybe even being slightly physically abusive. Now, to be sure, right, it still feels bad living in an abusive relationship. But to people looking at these kinds of relationships from the outside in, they wonder, how on earth are people still deciding to stay in these? But it's important to remember that as you're living in these abusive relationships for days and weeks and months or even years, it starts to feel like everyday living because they start adapting to all the chaos that's happening in the household. So the moral of the story here is that if you know somebody that's living in an abusive relationship, don't immediately assume that they know exactly how bad it is, because they may also be adapting to all the horrible things that are happening in the household, which is leading them to believe it's not quite as bad as it actually is. Okay. Any thoughts, comments, or insights on that? Okay. So now that you have a better idea about how we sense and adapt to stimuli in our environment, now I want to start taking our tour across the various different types of sensory experiences that people can experience, beginning with arguably our most important sense, our visual system. Okay. Now, across every single sensory experience that we're going to be talking about today, as well as in our next class, the general process from sensation to perception is exactly the same. Across every single sensory experience that we're going to talk about, it begins with a physical stimuli that is detected. In the case of the visual system, that physical stimulus is light waves. Those light waves are detected by sensory organs on our body, in this case, our eyes. And residing in our eyes are sensory receptors that begin the transduction process of converting those physical stimuli of light waves into neural impulses. Remember, our brain does not have any meaningful way to interpret light waves in and of their own right. Those light waves have to be converted into a language our brain can understand, neural impulses. And when those light waves are converted into neural impulses, they then travel inside of our brain and we begin the ultimate experience of vision. That is the general process that's going to unfold here. So with that said, now I want to talk a little bit about the different components of the eye involved in that process. Okay. Starting first with the outer portions of our eye. The first structure of our eye that the light waves pass through is known as the cornea. The cornea is this thick, transparent outer layer of the eye that the light waves pass through. And after they pass through the cornea, they then reach the pupil. The pupil is the dark part of your eye. And the function of your pupil is light regulation. We know that the pupil will dilate to let more light in, as well as constrict to let less light in. And there's a myriad of factors in our environment that could alter whether the pupil dilates or constricts. One obvious factor is the amount of light in your environment. So if you're in a really bright environment where there's tons of light, maybe even so much that you have to squint, your pupil is going to constrict to let less light in and also protect the health and integrity of your eye. In contrast, if you're in a really dark environment, very dimly lit, your pupil is going to dilate to let more light in and help you see. But there's also some psychological factors that can determine whether your pupil dilates or constricts as well. Take the emotion of fear. So let's say you see a spider scurry across your kitchen floor. And for the sake of argument, let's say you lost sight of where that spider is. Right? While you're looking for that spider and you're feeling that jolt of fear, your pupil is going to dilate to let more light in and help you find where that spider is. But now let's say you found the spider in the corner of your kitchen floor. Now your pupil is going to constrict to focus all of those light waves on one specific part of your kitchen floor, where that spider is located, to help you meaningfully respond to the creature. Okay. In fact, as one final example, the reason why people's eyes get big when they're staring at someone they have a crush at is because they like what they see. And you want to take in more light of this person that you have a crush on, right? Those are all factors that could determine whether the pupil dilates or constricts. Next, we have the iris. The iris is the colored part of your eye, and its function is also light regulation. And you may be wondering, hold on a second, I thought the pupil's role was light regulation. Well, they're both involved in that function. And the way you want to think about the relationship is that the iris controls the pupil size. Okay, the iris controls the pupil size. Let me give you an analogy. Take your car. What ultimately turns your car left or right are the tires. But there is a structure inside of your car that determines whether those tires turn left or right. That structure is the steering wheel. The steering wheel controls the wheels of your car in the same way that the iris controls the pupil size. And that's the way you want to think about the relationship between those two structures. Last, we have the lens. The lens is involved in distance regulation. We note that the lens will refocus itself to help you see things really far away or really close up. In fact, as a very easy application of the lens, the reason why some people may need corrective lenses or eyeglasses like myself is because their lens is no longer bending the light in such a manner to help them see really close up or really far away. Okay. Now, after those light waves pass through these outer structures of the eye, they then hit the back inner portion of our eye. Now, the inner portions of our eye contain very important structures that begin the transduction process of converting light waves into neural impulses. Okay? The first structure that those light waves hit is the retina. The retina is important because it contains the sensory receptors that convert light waves into neural impulses. And those sensory receptors that are contained on the retina are known as the rods and the cones. Remember the rods and the cones for your second exam. They are the sensory receptors that begin the transduction process of converting those light waves into neural impulses. Now, although they're both involved in that transduction process, they do have slightly different functions. The rods respond in low light conditions, and they help you see in the dark. In other words, they somewhat enable your night vision. Your cones, on the other hand, respond in well-lit environments, and they enable you to see color: red, blue, green, orange, yellow, and so forth. The way in which you can remember the cones is that the cones are for color. C and C, the cones are for color, okay? After the rods and cones convert those light waves into neural impulses, they then are passed through the optic nerve. The optic nerve is essentially the bridge between your eye and your brain, okay? After the light wave, the neural impulses, after the neural impulses pass through the optic nerve, they then go inside of your brain and they first hit one important structure that first processes all sensory experiences. Who remembers the structure of your brain from our lecture on biology and the mind that first processes all sensory experiences? It starts with a T. It's a part of the limbic system.
Is it the thalamus?
It is the thalamus, right? The thalamus first processes all of our sensory experiences. And once it's done, it then relays it to the part of our brain that more specifically handles visual information. Who remembers what lobe of our brain is responsible for processing visual information? Lobe of the brain from our, yes, the occipital lobe. And residing in our occipital lobe is the primary visual cortex, which then gives you the ultimate perceptual experience of vision. Okay, that is the general process. Okay. Now, if you're paying close attention to the object that this eye is looking at, you'll notice it's a candle. And when the light waves associated with that candle hit the back of your eye at the retina, you'll notice that the candle is represented upside down. And the reason that's happening is because your eye is curved, right? Your eye is curved. So when the light waves pass through your cornea, they're actually hitting the inner part of your eye in an inverted fashion. So how do we see the world right side up? Well, it turns out your brain is doing all the heavy lifting. When those light waves associated with that candle are transduced into neural impulses, your brain then processes the image right side up, and you see the world right side up. That's how that happens. So as I think you're beginning to realize, there's a lot of very delicate moving parts associated with your ability to see. And if there is damage or inhibition to any of these structures, that can significantly alter your ability to see. In fact, to some extent, it's kind of a miracle that we can see at all. So I also want to give you at least a few ideas of some of the factors that could cause a blindness. One of these factors is damage to your rods and cones. Remember, the rods and cones are important because they transduce light waves into neural impulses. Seeing isn't happening out there in the world like you think it is. Seeing as we know it happens in our minds. And our brain doesn't have any built-in mechanism to meaningfully interpret light waves out there in the world. So if your rods and cones aren't converting those light waves into neural impulses, you do not see. It's as simple as that. But even when those rods and cones convert the light waves into neural impulses, if your optic nerve is damaged and the neural impulses aren't being passed into your brain, you do not see. Again, remember, those neural impulses have to make it into your brain in order for seeing to be experienced. But even when those neural impulses make it into your brain, if there's damage to your thalamus, the occipital lobe, the primary visual cortex, that can also potentially cause blindness. Okay. So with this in mind, it's very important to maintain the overall health and integrity of your eye. So where I'm going next is I want to give you a brief rundown of the three primary functions of our visual system. One of the functions is light regulation. Who remembers the structures in your eye that are involved in light regulation?
The pupil and iris.
Exactly, the pupil and the iris. Remember, the iris controls the pupil size. This is the relationship between them. Okay. Now, to give you an application of this, a lot of doctors, teachers, and just everyday citizens have become increasingly concerned about the role that blue light consumption is having on the overall health and integrity of your eyes. Of course, I'm talking about blue light from your phones, your tablets, your computers, and so forth. And although there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that blue light consumption will cause you to go blind, we do have a wealth of evidence to suggest that a lot of blue light consumption can cause a significant amount of eye strain, right? So we're talking about itchy eye, watery eye, red eye, headaches, strain, tiredness, and so forth. Likewise, we also know that when you're staring at a screen, you're actually blinking less. And blinking, as it turns out, is exceptionally important because blinking remoisturizes your eye. So if you're blinking less when you're staring at a screen, that also can cause red eye, itchy eye, or dry eye. Finally, we also know that blue light can also interfere with your ability to fall asleep because it inhibits the amount of melatonin secretion in your body. Okay. Now, to be sure, there are plenty of people that can go to sleep perfectly fine after they just looked at their phone or they're watching TV and so forth. But the point here is if you are someone that does have trouble sleeping, the last thing you want to do is make it even more difficult for yourself by looking at a screen right before bed. And that's the general takeaway message from that. Now, for some people, the strain is so bad that they can even experience what is known as computer vision syndrome, where sometimes just 10 to 20 minutes into a screen time session can be enough to start causing a significant amount of strain. In fact, I'm a personal example of this. So when I was in college, I used to experience really bad computer vision syndrome just 20, 30 minutes into using my computer to do schoolwork. And it was getting so bad that I was actually having a difficult time completing my work online because I was just experiencing a lot of headaches and strain and so forth. But I went to the doctor and they recommended tinting all of my screens to amber. So the setting on your phones and digital devices is usually called something like night mode. And when you turn your devices to night mode, it gives the screen an amber tint, which reduces the amount of blue light that's actually hitting your eyes. And that was enough to reduce a lot of the symptoms I was experiencing from computer vision syndrome. So, of course, the recommendation here to you all is if you experience a lot of strain, especially in these times when we're all working on our computers, that may be one thing you want to consider. Any questions on light regulation? Okay, another big function of our visual system is distance processing. Who remembers the structure of your eye that's involved in distance processing?
Lens.
Right, the lens. We know that the lens will flatten to help you see things far away and thicken to help you see things close up. And to give you an application of this, we also have a lot of evidence that when you're staring at a small screen, that could potentially cause a significant amount of strain. But it turns out not just screens, but also staring at anything close up for an extended period of time, say 2 hours, 3 hours, maybe even reading a book for long periods on end can start to cause some strain in your eyes. Because when you're staring at something close up, your lens is thickening, and that also uses a lot of muscles in the back of your eye that after 3-4 hours of staring at something close up can start to cause some strain, as in the case of working out any muscle for 4 or 5 hours straight. So the general recommendation is to give yourself some breaks, right? After maybe an hour or two of a screen time session or even reading a book, right? Take a break and look at something far away for at least 10, 20 minutes. Finally, let's say you do that. Let's say you go to give yourself a break from a 3-hour screen time session to look at something far away. And you'll notice that when you spontaneously go to look at something far away after that screen time session, everything looks kind of blurry. And the reason it looks blurry is because your lens is refocusing to help you see things far away. And it's in that refocusing period that everything looks a little blurry for at least a few seconds. And that's how that happens. Any questions on distance processing? Okay, one last big function of our visual system is color processing. Who remembers the structure of our eye involved in color processing?
Cone.
The cones, right? Now, critically here, this is also important for your second exam. It's not the rods and the cones. It's just the cones, okay? The cones are for color, okay? C and C, or cones are for color, right? To refresh your memory, The rods activate and respond in low light environments and enable you to see in the dark, right? They somewhat enable your night vision. Whereas the cones respond in well-lit conditions and they enable you to see color. And to make that distinction as clear as possible, let's consider the difference between dark versus light adaptation. Starting first with dark adaptation. As its name implies, dark adaptation refers to instances where people have to adapt to going into a dark environment. Now, the prototypical scenario associated with this is usually going into a dark movie theater. So let's say it's in the middle of the day and it's bright outside, but then you decide to go see a movie. And when you walk into that dark movie theater, you're basically blind. You can't see very well. And the reason that's happening is that when you are outside in that well-lit environment, your rods were relatively more bleached because your rods are relatively less needed in a very well-lit environment. So when you walk into a dark movie theater, your rods have to unbleach themselves and sensitize to that dark environment. And that unbleaching process for your rods takes about 10 to 20 minutes. But after that 10 to 20 minutes, your rods become sensitized to the dark environment and you can actually see pretty well in the dark. But then the movie's over and it's time to walk outside. And you'll notice that when you walk outside of a movie theater back into the world, you're temporarily blinded by the light. And the reason you're temporarily blinded by the light is because when you were in that dark movie theater, your cones were relatively more bleached, right? They're not quite as needed in a very dark environment. And they're especially not ready for when you walk outside and all this light is hitting you all at once, right? Now you have to adapt to going into a light environment. Your cones have to unbleach themselves and sensitize to the light. Fortunately, that unbleaching process only takes a few seconds, which is why you're only blinded by the light for a few seconds and not necessarily for 10 to 20 minutes on end. And this is very relevant to that bathroom example that I heard earlier, that when it's really dark and you turn on your bathroom light, you're temporarily blinded by the light, right? You have to adapt to going into that new light environment, but it only takes a few seconds. Any questions on that? Okay, remember the difference between dark adaptation and light adaptation for your second exam. I guarantee you there will be at least maybe one, maybe two questions on that because I want you to be able to distinguish between the rods and the cones. Okay, so keep that in mind for your second exam. All right, so yes, one big function of our visual system is color processing. And with that in mind, I also want to talk at least a little bit about some theories of color processing. By starting with the theory of color processing, you've probably at least heard a little bit about before you even came into this class. That theory is trichromatic color theory. And according to trichromatic color theory, we have three primary color receptors or cones: red, blue, and green. So according to trichromatic color theory, not all cones are created equal. We actually have different kinds of cones that are sensitive to different wavelengths of light. For example, we find that we have S cones, where short wavelengths of light trigger our S cones that give you the ultimate perception of blue. We also know that medium wavelengths of light trigger our M cones. The M stands for medium wavelengths of light. And that gives you the ultimate perception of green. Finally, long wavelengths of light trigger our L cones. L cones stand for long wavelengths of light, and they give you the ultimate perception of red. Now, a critical part of trichromatic color theory is that different combinations of these three primary cone receptors can produce virtually any color on the spectrum. Right? So red and green make yellow, and red and blue make magenta or purple. And when all three of these cone receptors are active at the same time, you get white. Now, you may be wondering, hold on a second, when I'm painting and I mix a bunch of paint colors together, I don't get white, I get black. And that is absolutely true. What we see here is the difference between what is known as additive versus subtractive color mixing. And I'm not going to have you remember the difference between additive and subtractive color mixing for your first exam because there's a lot more details of that I just don't have enough time to go into. But to at least give you a general idea, when you're mixing a bunch of light colors together, right? We're talking about natural light out there in the world. That triggers a process known as additive color mixing, where all of those light waves hit the back of your eye at the same time at the same intensity. And when they're all combined together, you'll end up getting white, which can be considered all colors. In contrast, when you mix a bunch of paint colors together, it triggers a process known as subtractive color mixing, where some of those wavelengths of light absorb each other, and you're left with less overall wavelengths of light in the back of your eye that you started with, which can give you the color perception of black, which can also be considered the absence of color. And to make that point a little bit clearer, how black could potentially be considered the absence of all color, consider color blindness. Starting first with partial color blindness. The most common type of partial color blindness is red and green color blindness, where individuals may have a difficult time distinguishing between red or green, or just have a complete inability to see red and green altogether, or in some other instances have a more muted perception of those colors. Depends on the intensity and severity of the problem. But whatever the case may be, red and green color blindness typically stems from your red and green cone receptors not sensitized to their respective wavelengths of light. All right, well, what about complete color blindness? Well, that typically occurs when all three of your three primary cone receptors are not sensitized to their respective wavelengths of light. And as a consequence of that, you get a person who is color blind, where their perception of the world ends up being somewhat more gray and dull, and in some cases even black, the absence of color. Okay. Any questions on trichromatic color theory? Okay. Now, although trichromatic color theory provides a very parsimonious and intuitive explanation for how we see color, it has a very difficult time explaining after image effects. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to stare at this image here until I tell you to stop. And when I tell you to stop, I want you all to spontaneously shift to this black dot here. So start staring at this image. Okay, shift over to the black dot. What do you see?
Nothing.
You don't see anything? Anyone see anything after they stared at that?
Like for a brief minute, like the outline of the last image.
Okay, an outline. Anyone
I
see
saw an
colors?
X and then like green. I think like a green square, something like that.
Okay. Anyone else?
It was kind of bright behind the black dot, and then like my eyes adjusted.
Gotcha. And then it shifted back to white.
Yeah.
So maybe I didn't have you stare at it long enough. That's very possible. But what you're supposed to see, right? So I'm sure many of you have at least experienced some sort of after image effect at some point in your life, where what you're supposed to see after staring at that and then shifting to that black dot is the British flag, right? The Union Jack, right? So you're supposed to see the colors associated with blue and red, right? Did anyone see that?
I just did it again and I saw purple.
I saw.
Purple, okay. Okay, you saw it. All right, so that's what you're supposed to see, right? So maybe keep staring at that, shift back to it, maybe you'll have the experience. But the theory that explains these kinds of after image effects is known as opponent process theory of color. And according to opponent process theory of color, opposing retinal processes enable color vision. Okay, we have opposing retinal processes that enable color vision. Okay, what does that mean? Well, according to opponent process theory, our cone receptors are paired in twos. So, for example, our red cones are paired with green, and our yellow cones may be paired with blue. Critically, no two colors of a pair can be activated at the same time. So when you're staring at green, your green cones are active, but your red cones are temporarily inhibited. So how does this explain these afterimage effects? Well, when you're staring at the green on this image, okay, your green cones are active and your red cones are inhibited. But as you keep staring at green, your green cones are becoming more and more fatigued and weak. So when you spontaneously shift to that black dot, your red cones spontaneously take over because your green cones are inhibited, which gives you the perception spontaneously of red, at least for a few seconds. Well, what happens with yellow? Yes, question.
Yeah, I was about to say, is this why like when you have like green and red like really close together, it looks weird?
It can, right? So what's supposed to happen, right? Especially when you're talking about distinct colors, is that when you're staring at something green, you don't see green as greenish red. You should just see it as green because your green cones are active and your red cones are inhibited. But I can see how there could be some instances that could blur the line here and make it a little bit gray, which could make the perception a little bit altered and distorted. But that's the general idea behind opponent process theory of color. Only one cone of a pair can be activated at the same time. What about yellow? So when you're staring at yellow on this image, your yellow cones are active, but your blue cones should be temporarily inhibited. But as you keep staring at yellow, your yellow cone should become more and more fatigued and weak. So when you spontaneously shift over to the black dot, you should spontaneously see blue because blue then takes over, at least momentarily. Now, you may be wondering, right? Well, how do you see yellow if there's no yellow cones? Well, consider that opponent process theory of color is not at odds with trichromatic color theory. We still have three primary cone receptors, red, green, and blue. So when you're staring at yellow, your red and green cone receptors are active to produce yellow, but because yellow is paired with blue, blue is temporarily inhibited, which is why when you look at yellow, you don't see it as yellowish blue, you just see it as yellow. And that's the general idea. Any other thoughts, comments, or insights on that? Okay, well, keep staring at that image later. Hopefully you see the afterimage effect. In any case, in summary, we just talked about three important functions of our visual system: light regulation, distance processing, and color processing. There's still one last function of our visual system that I want to talk about for today, and that's perceptual organization, how we organize our world perceptually, courtesy of what is known as Gestalt theory. And according to Gestalt theory, people perceive whole images rather than individual parts. People have an automatic tendency to perceive whole images rather than their individual parts. The phrase that's most commonly associated with Gestalt theory is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Remember that for your second exam. But what does that mean? Well, first, let me give you an analogy unrelated to perception, and then I'll shift to perception. So in the NBA, basketball, analysts often say that if you put the best 5 players on a team, they should beat anybody in the league. Because when you add up the sum of their talent, or the sum of their parts, they should beat anyone out there. And often that happens, but not all of the time. Because sometimes the team is more important than the sum of the talent, or the whole is more important than the sum of its parts. Well, how does that apply to perception? Well, when you stare at, say, a car, when you look at that car, you don't see a bunch of individual parts like rods and nuts and bolts and tires and carbon fiber. You see a whole, meaningful car because you know what a car looks like, and your mind will automatically put all those pieces together to provide you with the perceptual experience of a car. But if a child looks at a car for the very first time, they may not see a whole car. They may look at the individual parts first. In fact, they may look at the tire and say, ball, that's a ball. Okay? And it's easy to take these kinds of processes for granted, but they're exceptionally important because they allow our mind to impose a sense of order, structure, and predictability on our world. Okay? And if we didn't do this automatically, life would probably feel very confusing, fragmented, and probably not make a whole lot of sense. Let me give you an example. So take this image here in the bottom right-hand corner. So when you stare at this image, what most people see is a whole cube, okay? But other people, right, end up seeing some of the individual parts first. They may see a bunch of circles with crosses through them. And if you don't see these circles with crosses through them naturally, stare at this X here. And when you stare at this X for an extended period of time, you'll notice that the image begins to move a little bit. And it'll move in such a way that these circles with crosses through them will start coming into the forefront of your vision, or they can become relegated to the background. Okay? Does anyone see those circles? What do you guys see when you look at this image?
When I first looked at it, I saw kind of like a diamond, but after you said cube, I saw the cube.
And that's also interesting. In fact, that's very consistent with Gestalt theory, because the idea here is that when you have an expectation about what the world should look like, your mind will start putting these individual pieces together to see a whole meaningful object, right? That is incredibly consistent with Gestalt theory. So somebody saw a shape. Did anyone see the circles with crosses through them first? So I got a yes here in the chat. So how does this happen? Well, that happens because of one important element of Gestalt theory known as the figure versus ground effect, which refers to our ability to perceive an object such as a figure as distinct from its surroundings or the ground. So let's take this illusion on the left-hand side. When you stare at this illusion on the left-hand side, you'll either see a white lamp or vase in the middle, or you'll see two black faces looking at one another on the sides. And what you see here depends on what your mind is automatically treating as the focal object versus the background. If you see the white vase primarily, your mind is treating that white vase as the focal object, whereas the black splotches in the background are just relegated to the context. In contrast, if you see the two faces looking at one another prominently, your mind is treating that as the focal object, whereas the white splotch in the middle as more of the background. And for many people, myself included, you kind of see both objects kind of shift in and out of focus from maybe the faces being more in the focal point, and then they start becoming relegated to the background and so forth. What do you guys see when you look at this? So I see some boats in the chat. I know a lot of people end up seeing the faces from past experience, myself included. In fact, as we're going to learn in our next class, the human mind has a pervasive tendency to see faces in just about everything. So if anything, that ends up being the dominant thing people typically see when they look at this illusion. But many people can also see both, as I'm seeing here in the chat. But to give you a potentially more dramatic illustration of this, take a look at this illusion on the right-hand side. So when you stare at this illusion on the right-hand side, you're either going to see a young woman or an old woman. Now, for me, I only ever see the young woman But I've been told that the old woman this is her mouth right here, right? And this is her, I think, her eye, and this is her nose. But that's just what I've been told. I only ever see the young woman. What do you guys see? Young or old woman? Okay, so we kind of have, I see a both, I see old, I see young. So we're seeing some discrepancies here. Anyone else want to share what they've seen? Old woman? More boths? Right, so again, we see more really interesting illustrations of how two people, or in this case, many people, can look at the same object or image and see vastly different things, right? Which kind of brings us full circle from where we started with that dress. That at the level of sensation, you're all taking in those light waves in exactly the same way. The differences we're seeing here are happening at the level of perception, how our mind is automatically interpreting these sensory pieces, putting them together to see a whole meaningful object. And that's the importance and significance of Gestalt theory. Any questions on that or anything we've talked about today? Okay, well, that's all we have time for. As always, feel free to reach out to me over email, office hours, whatever you need to do. I'm here to help you all succeed. Have a great rest of your day. We'll pick this up on Thursday where we continue our tour across our sensory experiences.
Have a good day, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Take care, everybody.